Have you ever been in a Bible study or a growth group or a Sunday school class where the teacher asked a question and just no one answered? It was just painfully and awkwardly silent. And you're sitting there thinking like, oh, like this is so cringy. We want to spare you from that pain. It's going to happen every time you lead a growth group. There are going to be moments when conversation is just not flowing that night. But as much as possible, I want this video to help encourage you and set you up for fruitful conversation and discussion with your students. And so a few types of bad questions to avoid asking are questions that are just so broad and vague. It's like, how would you even start to answer? So you think about walking through the Red Sea and you ask students, what do you think that would be like? It's just, I don't entirely know how to answer that question. It would be pretty cool. I mean, like, how do you answer that question? What do you think it would be like to walk through the Red Sea? On the surface, it seems like a good question. But you think through, how would you answer that question, right? It's so broad and it's so vague that it's a hard one to answer. Other questions that are tough are questions that are so specific and so easy to answer that it seems like a trap. It's like you're trying to get conversations started, so you think you'll throw out an easy question to the crowd, but it's such an easy question and it's such an obvious answer that surely it's a trap. But it's not. But instead, they don't answer because they're not sure. It seems so obvious. Other questions to avoid are those that you so clearly have a specific answer that you're looking for because that's your next point in the lesson, that every other answer they give is wrong. Now, students don't want to embarrass themselves in front of their peers by giving the wrong answer. So when it seems obvious that the teacher is looking for a right answer, they're not going to answer usually because they don't want to hear oh, that's a really good point, honey. Anyone else? And that anyone else is just like deadly to them because you might as well have just said, yeah, no. So what are some good types of questions to ask? We want to ask questions that can't be answered with one word. Yes, no, Jesus. Those should not be answers to the questions that we're asking. Because we want to ask questions that prompt conversation, that prompt some thoughtfulness. And so we want to ask questions that are content questions, that are reflection questions, and that are application questions. Content questions are questions that are look at verse 5. In this passage, what did Jesus do? Right? It's just look at the text and you can answer those questions. That you're digging into exploring the scriptures together and you're modeling for them how to study the Bible. Reflection questions are the types of questions that are like, okay, so when Jesus healed this blind man, if you were in the crowd, what would you feel in that moment when this man who was born blind and you've seen him his entire life just kind of like begging on the street corner, now all of a sudden he's healed? What are some questions that you would have in your mind as you watched this thing happen? Right? So you're helping them to put themselves into the story a little bit, to ask some questions about it from a different vantage point and a different perspective. You're helping them to reflect on what just happened. What did they just read about? What did they just hear? And what's their experience of that? Where do they agree? Where do they maybe disagree with different interpretations of it? And then application questions have to do with the head, the heart, and the hands, and the mouth. And what do we think about this? How do I need to think differently? How do I feel because of God's promise for me when I suffer in life, or when my friends do this or that because of the gospel? How do I feel differently than I would if I wasn't a Christian? How do I live differently and interact with my peers and family and whoever else because of the gospel? Now, one thing that's helpful with application questions is to apply it to a hypothetical peer before you apply it to them. So in application questions, don't jump to you type questions. Instead of saying, what would this look like for you in school this week? First, ask, now, if there was a Christian teenager in your school who was going to carry out what Paul says in this passage, what do you think that would look like? What would that teenager do? What would that, what impact would that make, right? So you're applying it to a hypothetical peer of theirs. And then once they've discussed that, because it's safer, then you can encourage them to think about, what's one thing that we might be able to work on this week as we continue this walk of faith. And so last bit of wisdom that I have for you here is don't answer your own questions. I know this is a hard one, especially when there's a bit of silence, because silence can be really awkward. But instead of answering your own question, reword it. Or better yet, since every growth group has 2 leaders, reword each other's questions for you, right? That when you're teaching, you don't want to get hung up to dry by your co-leader. So help each other out. If there's some awkward silence, be prepared to pitch in, not to answer their question, but to reword their question in order to benefit the other students and to open up some conversation. Because sometimes students might just need 5 to 10 seconds of silence to think through what they have to say. They also know that if they wait 3 seconds and then you're going to just answer and bail them out, then they have zero reason to need to engage and to answer any questions, because they know that they can just wait you out and you'll do it for them, and then they don't have to actually think about it all. So I hope that this is a helpful video to help you be well prepared to have great growth groups this year. I look forward to talking with you all and collaborating in our ministries together. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for your friendship. And I am praying for you.